Bai, bai. Yes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Garbi da ezta.
Bai. Bat bi.
Bai, txan. Well, good afternoon. Now, just for finishing the conference, we will start the last session, the session regarding the fiscal equalization, intergovernmental transfer, and regional disparities. And as a way of opening this last session, we invited Itziar Aguirre, Vice Minister of Treasury of the Basque government, that Itziar Aguirre and the Basque government, together with Gemma Martinez and the provincial government of Bizkaia, helped to support us for organizing this conference, and we would like to thank both institutions. And they asked for giving some words for you. Itziar, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you, Mikel. Good afternoon to everybody. I just want to thank you, Mikel, especially to you, to invite us to be part of this forum or days to talk about the fiscal federalism. When he told me what you can talk about, I didn't really know what to talk about, and he gave me some tips of what he thought it would be interesting for you, and that's what I prepared. I will try to be very short and precise, and don't spend too much time in things that maybe you don't need. But apart of that, I think I will start with my presentation. Thank you again to Ituna, and thank you again to everybody for coming here. I said economic agreement, unilateral risk in times of crisis. That's the name of my essay. Just a tip, this is the Basque Country, the autonomous community, 2 million people, density 463 of the population of Spain. Just to put in context. This is our GDP of the Basque Country in 2019, the GDP per capita, and the GDP 595 of the GDP of Spain. Yesterday, Gemma, the representative from the Bizkaia deputation, asked about or talked about the responsible system of the unilateral risk of the economic agreement. I think he's talked about a unique system where the system is already responsible and the system has its own risk. Why it has, and I have to talk about the results, good or bad, are only for the Basque Country. The responsibility for decisions about tax and how do we decide what kind of taxes we have, it's also ours. The contribution to the common spending, Gemma talked yesterday about the quota, is independent from the financial situation. We have to give the money to Spain, even if we have a crisis or even if we have any other problem. To determine the quota, no Basque administration can resolve about the number. It's already decided about the Spanish budget. I will show you later how it is. And that makes us responsible in a good provision of public services. That's the system. I will try to explain you how it reacts in a crisis situation. Yesterday, Gemma talked about the system. It's the economic agreement, its own and singular taxation and financing system, who establishes and regulates taxation and financial relations, acknowledges regulatory and management capacity within the scope of taxation for the foreign territories, and with that, first, we contribute to all exclusive powers of Spain through the quota, And second, financing our own powers. Which are our own powers? That's an example. There is not all the details, but at least you can see that we have education, health, industry and commerce, transport, public works, police, housing, environment, agriculture, tourism, labor and social welfare, justice, and prison since 2021. And of course, our own tax system. As Gemma said yesterday, and I repeat today, all the three territories are responsible of extraction, management, liquidation, collection, and inspection of all taxes in the Basque Country. And I say one exception, customs. But as you see, all the system is in the territories. And one thing that yesterday Gemma said, and I have to repeat because it's a very important part of the system, is that the Basque Country finances the exclusive powers of the states, or cost not assumed is the name. The Basque Country gives the money to the state. And how we calculate that money is 624 is our percentage, the one we use to pay the Spanish government. And how we know this 624? Well, it's an attribution index, and it's more or less the Basque relative income looking to the state overall income. You saw before in the first diapositive, you say that we were 595, so it's not exactly, but it's an agreement of 1981, and we keep with that because we think that it's a good balance in the time. And you see, we see the general budget of Spain, and we put 624 to the expenditure credits of the exclusive powers reflected in that budget. This is a more detailed thing about the cupo, the quota, but just to see one thing important to know what happens when we have the risk. We don't calculate the quota with all the costs not assumed every year. We do it once every 5 years, and then we use some indicators to renew every year. And these indicators also are depending on the Spanish budget. And we work with a provisional quota during the year, and we liquidate when we finish the year. So this is all the competencies, all the powers. Again, remember, all the unilateral risk. In times of COVID too, that's the question. We'll see. What happened when the COVID came? The Basque Tax Administration employed the OECD roadmap and recommendation when designing their fiscal policies to confront the COVID-19. Mikel has an essay about that. You can follow it if you want, but I think it's a good work. Tax. We used our tax powers to shock measures were first approved to facilitate liquidity, and then measures to encourage the restart of the activities. And then with public spending, the Basque government had the most of the competencies, the most of the powers, so he had to take the leading role in the management, and he had to use more expenditure policies facing the pandemic in health, education, social welfare, and also subsidize for the maintenance of the economic activity. Provinces of historical territories, they kept safe the residences for the elderly. Spanish government kept employment benefits and assumed a big part of the cost of the pandemic. And I imagine that in all of the countries in the world, these only are some measures. No? All the countries had to do lots of things. What happened with those structural indicators? They went down 10%. We keep being 595, but it's just moves. What happened to our collection, tax collection? We say we went down 9.8% in 1 year. The Spanish tax collection went 8.8, so more or less we were in the same situation. What happened to the quota of the year 2020? I told you that the quota is a provisional quota of the year, and we liquidate it, we put it definitive in the next year. But what happened in the year 2020? The quota was exactly the same, because the quota is calculated with the Spanish budget, and the Spanish budget approved in the 2020 before the pandemic was the same, so we had to pay the same quota. So we had 10% less collection, same quota, and lots of cost and lots of things to pay. So what happened to the superávit and deficit of the Basque Country? Well, you see that it went right down in the scale. What we had to do in the economic agreement, also we have the capacity to agree with Spain our deficit and superávit objectives. So we were in 0.0 before the pandemic. We have to agree new budgetary stability objectives, minus 2.6, minus 2.2. At the end, we didn't need to use this. It was less, but we had to do this in March, in June, in July, and in September, because we were seeing that our revenues are going down. What happened to the debt of the Basque Country? You see the effect of the first crisis, 2008. We went up in the debt. And then once we were going down again, the COVID came, and we started going up again. It's you see like this, and we are still one of the autonomous communities with less debt. So you see that, but others are worse. It's not a good news for anyone, but what happened with the Spanish? I said that Spain took charge of lots of costs, no? Well, Spain, with the Spanish financing system, we are not there. What he did was keep with all the incomes they had. So he approved different laws, and he kept his incomes in the same stage. And we did participate in some funds that the state gave to the autonomous communities. In this one, as you say, I don't know if you speak Spanish, all of you, it says, al margen del sistema de financiación. It's a part of the Spanish system. So that means that we also had to participate. So they gave us the money, and it was 3.6 of the total of the money. Remember, we pay 624, we are 466 population, we are 595 in the PIB, and we got this, 3.6. It's okay, no, but don't. So you say, they gave us that money. That means that with the money they gave us, the system was, the system of the Basque Country or the unilateral risk was broken. Well, the Standard & Poor's, in our rating of the year 2020, said this in March 26. I give you a minute to read. So you see that Standard & Poor's says that it wasn't the money they gave us wasn't enough to think that our system was broken, and our system and singular system passed the COVID with a little bit more of debt that we will have to pay in the next year. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Itziar, for explaining to us the interesting financing system that we have in the Basque Country, and that we invite all of you also to start, if you want to carry out research about the economic agreement, you know that you have opened always the door of our research center, and we're always happy to talk about it and to provide any data that you need. So that's precisely the aim of our research center. So to finish, because we are already in the third session of the conference, we will discuss equalization in relation with territorial disparities, economic disparities. So as I would like to make some comments and develop more on this, but we don't have the time. So I will open the floor for our first speaker, Francisco Javier Romero. You can, if you want, come here. Okay. So.
Now, thank you. So first of all, I would like to excuse my colleague Alice Valdesalici from the Institute for Comparative Federalism at URAC Research in Bolzano-Bozen, because she was sick and so she had to cancel last minute her participation here with me. So I will present this paper about what we call paving the way for successful equalization. So the main aim of our paper is to investigate whether subnational participation can be considered as one of the determinants of a successful equalization. And we do this by resorting to the theories of contestatory federalism and adapting them to the dynamics of redistribution on a case study base. So precisely what we are going to present today are the preliminary results of a twofold constitutional study. First, a comparative investigation on the decision-making processes adopted by different federal systems for equalization-related decisions, and second, the implant of the case study results into the broader context of constitutional theories of contestatory federalism and the notion of dynamic equilibrium. What is still missing, and that we will aim to do in a third part, is testing this hypothesis in order to prove the existence of a causal link between institutional solutions and successful equalization. Successful equalization understood from the perspective I'm now going to explain. So first, a few words on the theoretical background. Equalization is normally investigated as a transfer of fiscal resources to offset differences in either public service capacity or in revenue raising capacity or public service cost. But equalization could also be investigated as a tool to manage intergovernmental conflicts. And adopting this later viewpoint, in fact, it emerged that redistribution schemes are conflictual by nature. And there is an inherent paradox related to equalization. On the one hand, interterritorial disparities might challenge the cohesion and the unity of a federal system or a given system. But on the other hand, the same redistribution of resources does also give rise to intergovernmental conflicts. So the success of equalization mechanism in governing these dynamics, reducing the gap, while also guaranteeing stability, varies from one case to another. And our study adopts this second viewpoint and investigates equalization mechanisms within the context of those constitutional theories of federalism and in order to explore the concept of dynamic equilibrium and contestatory federalism. So, starting from the assumption that the theories of federalism are theories of dynamic equilibrium, we assume that equalization mechanisms are just as important as, for example, the distribution of powers for their ability to keep or to change the existing equilibrium. And at the same time, in fact, they favor and constrain the inherent dynamism that characterizes the federal form of government. So, against this preliminary statement, we investigate equalization as a tool of adaptation, as an instrument that permits a federal system to evolve over time. And we assume that depending on how this is structured and how it works, it permits the system to evolve either within the constitutional boundaries or beyond them, threatening the existence of such order, be it the equalization compact or even the state as a whole. So we distinguish between successful and unsuccessful equalization, and we investigate whether subnational participation in equalization-related decisions might be considered as one of the determinants of this success. So to do so, we have first developed a definition of what might be considered a successful equalization from a constitutional viewpoint. And this is done, as I said, to resorting to the concept of contestation. Because we use contestation to trace the borderline between successful and unsuccessful equalization. All redistribution schemes give rise to intergovernmental conflicts, but there is a difference if these contestations are placed outside the constitutional borders or if they are inside the constitutional borders. So if this theoretical approach is applied to equalization, one might assume that a system is successful if existing disputes resolve in the recourse to the instruments made available by the constitutional order, or if they can legitimately be placed within this order. Conversely, equalization is unsuccessful if threats to the very existence of the equalization mechanisms or to the state are in place. So, what are the determinants of these contrasting results of one and another? Well, the basic idea is that the essential nature of interterritorial solidarity is a value that needs to be constructed over time. In fact, the acceptance of the need to equalize as a core component of federal system is linked to the degree of federal culture, to the degree of mutual trust present in a state. The higher the federal culture is, the higher the acceptance of the need to equalize in order to reduce interterritorial disparities would be. So, through the empirical analysis of different case studies, as I said before, Germany, Australia, Canada, Spain, and Italy, it emerges that the involvement of subnational governments in the governance of equalization might play a role, or, put differently, might be considered as one of the determinants of its successful or not results. So, in those countries where the involvement is stronger, de jure in Germany, de facto in Australia, contestation does exist, but it is conveniently located within the boundaries of the constitutional system. Whereas the opposite occurs when the degree of involvement is weak. We can think, for example, of the cases of Spain or Italy. So in these latter cases, threats to the very existence of the equalization system or even to the state as a whole emerge from time to time. We can think of the cases, for example, of Veneto in Italy or Catalonia in Spain. And we also found evidence of borderline cases where contestation is channeled within the system despite the lack of participatory tools, but due to a pre-existing high level of mutual trust of federal culture, be it the case of Canada. So this factor stands out as it impacts the degree of acceptance of the rules of the game by the subnational governments. The level of acceptance and, in the end, the successful or unsuccessful nature of equalization is strongly influenced by the effectiveness of the subnational government's participation in equalization-related decision-making, as this can be also considered as a trust-building tool. In other words, subnational governments are normally keener or accepting the rules they have previously agreed upon. And also, particularly if we keep into account that equalization schemes are not normally the result of technical choices, but rather of political compromises. So this brings us also to another conclusion, that is that whenever subnational governments can resort to tools of effective contestation within the boundaries of the constitutional system, the equilibrium is kept, although it is in most of the cases dynamic in nature. And finally, it also leads to somehow questioning the terminological choice of including under the concept of contestation both the extraordinary tools and those institutions and instruments that work effectively in guaranteeing the functioning of the system and its ability to evolve over time for its very survival. The question arises in the end to whether these physiological components should be in fact attributed to the concept of contestation and not rather to those of participation or negotiation. So this is because equalization dynamics bring out a clear difference between the inherent adversarial dynamics and the threats to the very existence of the constitutional or the federal order, suggesting that there's probably a need for further research on contestatory and dynamic federalism with regard to the value and importance of federalism as participation, but also of federalism as negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco Javier. We will wait for the questions to the discussion part. So we'll follow with Gisela. She will be our next speaker.
So, thank you so much. My topic is very close to that what is official for this conference. And we have in Germany just a coincidence of two events. The one is the reform of fiscal equalization scheme, and in the same year, COVID changed a lot of data in fiscal federalism statistics. I will very briefly, I know 10 minutes, I'll show you several pictures and a certain numbers. Don't go to the details, I just get an impression on the pictures what has been changed and what are the outcomes. And I think the last file is further perspectives is the most important file, and it's very, very close. So 2020 reform of state equalization, we will no longer have horizontal payments from the rich to the poor states. This is now all included into the distribution of VAT, tax revenues, the state, the share which belongs to the states. We have lowered the equalization rate. We have a higher inclusion of the local fiscal capacity. This works in favor of the poor states because those who have a low state fiscal capacity also have a low and even lower local fiscal capacity. And now we have had the old instrument of that the federation pays additional supplementary grants to those states who are deficient or under average fiscal capacity after the horizontal equalization. And the new instrument, which might be very interesting, that there are a second type of deficiency compensating federal supplementary grants. That is that those local tax capacities below 80% of the average get another compensation, almost or a bit more than half of that difference will be compensated by transfer payments of the federation, but these go not to local governments, they go to the states where local governments are located. And my question for my paper is, was the new stable to stabilize COVID-19 effects among the states? Because we always learn if there is a crisis, it's not evenly distributed across the country. We have the same effects like in Spain. Mostly the economically strong states are hit more severely, but you will see there are some very crazy events. So we have had a high spread. You can see the numbers. I can send you all the stuff later. Particularly Eastern Germany with a lower vaccination rate had much higher death rates from COVID than others. And I tested whether there is a relation between the changes of economic capacity and infection rates or death rates, but there is no. The correlation coefficients are very close to zero. That means that the economics effects don't follow lockdowns, don't follow infection rates, not in 2020 and not in 2021. However, what we can see, COVID-19 had severe effects on GDP growth. It even shrinked in 2020, but it was overcompensated for the most states in 21. And I show you here the picture. You can see here the decline in 2020 in red, and that is the highest for the city-state Hamburg. It's one of the highest GDP per capita as a city-state. It is always like this. But also the old industrial region of the Saarland, our old coal and mining and steel industry, which never exist in the Saarland, they are hit mostly, and they even have, in a result, a negative growth rate across both years. The compensation for them didn't take place completely. But others most have higher degree of have positive growth rates across the 2 years. And you see one, Rhineland-Palatinate, the state where my university is located, has a tremendous growth rate. You know why this is? It's just one enterprise. It's the location of BioNTech, which made Rhineland-Palatinate from a rather poor and fiscally weak state to one of the big players. Just one enterprise did that. And you can see that later with the tax capacities. But I will just start very briefly with the vertical effects. We have in other states decline. We have expenditures just from the top. The federation did the most, the states too. Local governments were executing but had the weakest effects. And you can see here in the upper part of that table, you have the expenditure. You see here that the federation spent about 30% more in 2020 than in 2019. That was just giving the full power to expenditure management. And even in 21, there was still another increase of about 10%. It was a bit weaker for the Länder, but even for local governments, 6 and 3.5% is a lot. The tax revenues declined at highest for the federation, followed by local governments, but they got, as we yesterday learned, a compensation from federation and state level governments. And the Länder had 5% losses, and that overcompensation you see in 21, the federation has the pullback is the weakest, and they do not have the same amount of tax revenues as it was in 2019. But the states are rather, it's 24 billion euros more than in 2019. And even local governments, well, they can walk with thick feet. And in Germany, you see here social insurances. They belong as a special type of administration to the federation, to the federal level. You see here that they have a very important part in fighting against pandemic with a plus of 10% of expenditures and a rather slow growth of contributions, growth of contributions in 2020. So let's look to growth rates of per capita state and fiscal capacity. You see here the spread of the growth rates of fiscal capacity of the states is much higher than the spread of the economic growth rates of GDP. That comes from the multipliers, what is the expression? The elasticity of the tax system. That brings income tax much higher when you have a positive growth rate. And you see here, even Rhineland-Palatinate had, in 2021, an increase of tax income revenues of about 30%. I never had that. But also Hamburg, highest losses in 2020, but in 21 it's plus 20%. You see, it is just really imbalanced. There's a high spread. And here, this is just the same. And I measured the divergence, the spread, with a variation coefficient. That means that in 2019 we had almost, the coefficient was about 28%. It was lower, 26% in 2020, and increased after the recreation in 2020. It was even higher than in 2019. That means the divergence has been increasing across the pandemic crisis. That is local, not state, that is local, that's the same. You see here a decrease of the spread for all the years. Local fiscal capacity is convergent and not slightly, but that are strong declines. And that was then the effect of the state fiscal equalization system in 2019. You see the small green bars here. That is the horizontal payments. When they are below zero, that were the states paying. They were 4, Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, Hesse, and Hamburg, very slightly. And when the green bars are on the positive side, these states have received transfer payments, and these are almost, and the city-states are the highest recipients. No, you cannot see the flash I have here. You can see that, and in the end, it's except city-states and some of the rich remain rich. It's not so much. And then have a look on 2020, the reform. Even if the total level is lower because of the loss of tax revenues, you see here the distribution effect is included into the VAT. What we had before as a green and a red bar is now included totally in the red ones. And the federal supplementary grants for compensating deficiencies are the green ones. They are important revenues for the poorer states. And there are some other very small federal supplementary grants. And what you see here, that after fiscal equalization, the majority of the states has almost the same level of revenues per capita. Only the city-states are higher because they have higher needs indicator. And there are some of them that is the old paying states, Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, and Hesse, they remain above the average. They have more than the others. So that is 21, that's the same thing. And here again, I calculated the variation coefficient. Before fiscal equalization, you have the same measures as I mentioned before. But after fiscal equalization, they are just 12%. It has just slightly declined. It's not very much change from the reform. And you see here that fiscal equalization even was an insurance against the horizontal spread of effects of the crisis. The increasing, just for your information, the Federation pays in each year more than before. I don't know whether this effect will be stable for the future, but in 21 and 20, the Federation paid more than before. Well, in the end, and that is the last numbers, you can see here the effect on public debt. We have had a lot of redemption and reduction of public debt in the late 2010 years. Germany had started after the financial crisis in 2010 with more than 2 billion euros public debt. In total, it was reduced from year to year. You can see here that the state, the Federation, had a tremendous increase in 2020 of almost 400 billion euros and continued again. And I can tell you in 22 they continue even more. The state, it's going slightly up, but not almost nothing in 2021. And local governments even reduced their debt in 21 and had a huge consolidation in that year. So there is an imbalance, a vertical imbalance for many reasons. And that is the question which comes to me after having looked into the details of economic effects of the crisis and the fiscal results, that if you look to the energy crisis and the ongoing fight against climate change, there is a next challenge for fiscal federalism. It might be a topic for the next conferences. We will follow this up. I think the effects on the economic structure and the GDP growth rates across the country might be different from that what we have seen in the COVID-19 crisis, because this time we have started a tremendous structural change in economic development, and even the old industrial locations are hit severely from that what we now see from the consequences of the war, and also the consequences of the increase of energy prices, and what we need to do with regard to climate change policies. So, but, well, we have in all crises seen an underfunding of public expenditures in the fight against these crises. It's always gone in public debt. And Germany has started, and it was mentioned yesterday, not to have it in the public budgets, in the official ones, but they hide it in budgets behind the official budget, in shadow budgets. And that's a result of these silly constitutional rules of our so-called debt brake, that we have to have balanced budgets. So they create reserves behind the budgets. They have behind the budgets new public debt pools. And what I see when I was in Berlin recently, well, there has been started a new discussion from the Federation whether state and local governments have too much money. And the Federation would have more. What we learned in the 2010 years was quite opposite. The Federation always had too much money and interfered in state and local tasks to give money there to influence them. And now they say, no, that's not our task. We will not continue funding, do it by your own. And state and local governments, they have the big personnel staff and staff bodies and have to pay for all the costs for the public services. They are underfunded. And even the quality of that, it's similar like in Spain and also in other countries. So what we are seeing, whether this silly debt rate will continue, there are important movements just to change it, but we don't know what role will be the future, what will be the regulation, the new rules for the future. And I expect also that we will still continue to have a discussion on vertical and horizontal fiscal equalization. In the fiscal equalization law, first time we have implemented a sunset clause that from 2027, one state can ask for an evaluation and a new discussion for new rules. It's far away, 2027, but I expect that the discussion for this will start now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gisela. Maybe it's interesting not only to compare equalization systems across countries, but also when reforms take place, because we've seen that maybe there is somehow a correlation between crisis and reforms and equalization systems. Here with the 2020 reform of the German equalization, but also in 2009 when in Spain we have the regional funding reform too. Thanks. So next will be Eva Maria Belsner. Yeah, thanks.
So, hello everyone. I want to talk about the fiscal equivalence trap that I discovered when I looked at the Swiss reaction to the COVID crisis. I apologize from this beginning that I'm not really an expert on financial issues, so I cannot present my research. What I present is just the observations of a federal scholar looking at what is happening in the country. So this is the plan, principle of fiscal equivalence, financial equalization, and its effects during the crisis. Well, as most of you know, the Swiss constitution codifies quite a strict principle of fiscal equalization in the constitution, saying that the collective body that benefits from a public service bears the costs, and the collective body that bears the costs of a public service may decide on the nature of that service. So the goal is to have that threefold congruency between those who benefit, those who bear the cost, and those who decide. Briefly, we call it whoever pays decides, and the other way around, whoever decides also pays. Because that produces inequality between the cantons, which have different opportunities to collect taxes, there is a equalization of financial resources and financial burdens, also codified in the Constitution. The principle is that there is no full equalization. We accept that the idea that after equalization we still have economic inequality between the cantons. There is resource equalization, which should ensure that economically weaker cantons have sufficient means to perform the tasks they have to perform. That resource equalization is mostly financed through horizontal equalization, 2/3 by the confederal government and 1/3 by the wealthy cantons. As for the cost equalization, compensates the excessive financial burdens linked to geographic or socio-demographic factors, which is special burdens of the Alpine cantons and special burdens for the city cantons entirely financed by the Confederation. So if we look at the financial strength of the cantons, it looks a bit like Germany. Very few cantons, 6, pay into the system, and all the 20 others profit from the system. So horizontal equalization is highly controversial, especially when it is decided by the Federal Assembly, in which the donor cantons can easily be put in the position of a minority. The effect of equalization are this. On the top you see the wealthy cantons. On the very bottom you see the low-income cantons. The black line is the average financial means a canton could generate if it would tax its population and its companies the way the Confederation taxes. And from that hypothetical income, you move everyone up to 86% of that average. So we end up with still quite relevant differences. It's also interesting to see that the canton of Zug, where all the big international companies pay taxes, really runs into an increasing deficit because the tax rate of that canton is lower than what the confederal government taxes, so they have to feed into the system without having the means to do so. Good. Now, if we look at the situation during the pandemic, we would first find that healthcare is normally a competence of the cantons, but that the federal government has a fragmentary competence which is limited to combating pandemics. In the law of epidemics, we have 3 situations: the normal one, the extraordinary situation, and the special situation. Now, during most parts of the crisis, Switzerland was in a special situation. In a special situation, the cantons are still in charge of running the health system and combating the pandemic. But in addition of that, the federal government is also empowered to enact health measures. So we have a situation of concurrent competencies, and the same goes in the economic sphere, concurrent competencies. This is just a timeline, and I want to talk about this phase during the first and the second wave, when the situation was declared to be a special one. Now, what happened during this time was that we ended up having a negative competence conflict. No one wanted to act. The Confederation was telling the cantons, now you should really issue a lockdown. Look at the numbers. Infection rates are going down. Would you please close your shops and restaurants, and because of fiscal equivalence, pay for what you decide? And the cantons would say, why don't you do that, please, federal government, and pay for it? In this situation, one of the newspapers has this series of saying, we need new words. The world needs new words, and every month they invent a word. And in summer it was federalising or something like that, a term that does not exist, federalen. And the journal explained it like that. You federate when, in a delicate situation, you shift the responsibility, the blame, onto the cantons, or the other way around. The journal also gave an example saying, the Federal Council maintained throughout the press conference that this was the responsibility of the cantons. In short, he was constantly at federating. And that's really what we could observe throughout the summer, that there would be joint press conferences where both sides would explain why the other side, the other tier, was now under urgent pressure to act. It was also interesting to see that during the extraordinary situation, the federal government would always be represented by the Federal Minister of Internal Affairs, and during the summer, all of a sudden, the Minister of Finances was explaining the cantons why it was now up to them to act. So really, we discovered what I then labeled the fiscal equivalence trap. Whoever pays decides, whoever decides pays, also works the other way around. Whoever does not decide does not pay. So the fiscal equivalence principle always obviously had some shortcomings. That public services are not always clearly limited to a geographic area, that we always have spillovers and free riders, but the system still was mostly designed to deal with positive conflicts. A negative conflict of competences, we realized that the constitutional framework was not really able to deal with it, to push or force any of the tiers to act. And the effects on the ground really have been quite bad. I mean, this is where we enter into the second wave, where we see numbers going up like crazy, hospitals being at the edge of what they could take, and at press conferences, we would still see that blame and competence shifting. Good. This being said, the financial impact of the pandemic have looked like this. We have the same situation as we have just heard by Gisela. Thanks to the silly debt break, I quote, all the expenditures due to COVID have not been put into the normal budget. This is why the budget still looks very reasonable and balanced, but the dark line going all the way down to the minus is the emergency spending, which is put in an extra budget and does not affect the debt balance. Financial impact, besides that, we can see that Switzerland has gone through the crisis in a quite healthy economic situation. Two tiers of government see quite a strong increase in public debt. It's the national tier and the local tier. Somewhere the cantons in between were not too affected by it. And I come to the conclusion, the financial equalization, we've always had a fight whether it should be a legal process or a political process. Strong pushes now to more strictly legalize the process, because those 6 cantons who feed into the system feel uncomfortable that the parliament is deciding by majority. There is broad agreement that tax competition should remain, that cantonal inequalities are acceptable. I think the real issue we have to tackle as a federal system is the concurrent competencies, requiring costly actions, and the problem of non-action or late action that we have experienced during the crisis. It seems quite clear that the problem is aggravated by fiscal equivalence. So one of the way forwards would be to have exclusive competences. At least you cannot shift the blame. Accountability is quite clear of who has to act. This would most likely lead to centralization, especially in such a small country. I mean, we had these long debates about who should issue mask mandates in public transports. Those of you who know Switzerland would know that if it's cantonal, you put it on and take it off every 10 minutes because the train rushes through these small cantons. Another proposal being circulating is that there should be exceptions to the fiscal equivalence principles in times of crisis. De facto, that is what we have done. After that experience of the failure to deal with the second wave, federal government just started to chip in. The last option is one we discuss in view of future crisis. Maybe there should be obligations to act, minimal standards, especially when we look at the next crisis, the energy crisis, which also requires high investment of all tiers, and there probably should be a legal framework guaranteeing that cantons invest heavily in infrastructure, even in situations where the profit will spill over to the rest of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eva Maria. So the next will be the South African case with Nico Steinler and Tinashe Tinuaba.
Bueno. Tinashe. Which is your... You sent it to Ituna, did you not? No, he suggested you send it to the email. Do you have it? pensar que iba a traer, no sé. Es bien, le digo algo ese. Ah, habla. Està al màxim, sí, perquè la Gabriela contesta. Està aquí.
Thank you very much. We've just been penalized with 5 minutes for our delay in getting going. So let's get going. We've got two presenters, myself and Tanashi Chiguata. And Jaap de Visser is hopefully also watching somewhere from afar. What we want to address is, in 1994, with democracy arriving in South Africa, there was great inequality amongst the newly established provinces and municipalities due to apartheid. So the goal of the intergovernmental fiscal system was to ensure state services being equalized, which under apartheid was highly discriminatory. And this equalization was to be done through the equitable share division of revenue raised nationally. So that will be divided between provinces to national provinces and local government, and then amongst the provinces and local government. Now, since 1994, we're now 28 years later, and we still see massive inequality between provinces. What has happened? Why has the problem persisted? Is it a problem with the equalization system per se, or are there other external factors that override or marginalize fiscal interventions? Now, let's start with the geographical inequality that apartheid gave the country. Now, first obvious one is that there's huge inequality amongst race. The highest Gini coefficient discrimination in favor of whites in the world. I think we're better than overtaken Brazil as the country. But that is geographically spread, mostly evenly. But there was also geographic discrimination. And it started off with these grand apartheid story of different Bantustans, ethnic homelands where Africans had to exercise their political rights, and there was an attempt for them to live in 13% of the country in highly impoverished areas, and they were labor reserves for the white economy in the rest of the country. And this has then translated in highly inequality in schooling, health, social welfare between the so-called white South Africa and then the various homelands. So this is the picture that we inherited in 1994. And the country was then, as part of a compromise, divided in 9 provinces. But 8 of these 9 provinces inherited the previous homelands with their pockets or the high poverty in these areas. And the 5 poorest provinces had the most of these previous homelands: Limpopo, Mpumalanga, KwaZulu-Natal, Eastern Cape, and Northwest. And these provinces then became responsible for health, education, social welfare, and economic development. So they were, the economic model is education, that would lead to greater economic development, but healthcare had to be equalized same as social welfare. But the provinces had no taxing power of any sorts to raise money to perform these functions. They were totally dependent, to 97% of their revenue, on transfers from the national government. National government dominating most of the important taxes, and that taxes would be collected by the national government and then distributed mainly through what we called the division of revenue, obviously, and then the provincial equitable share revenue amongst provinces. And so where there were, question would be rich provinces versus poorer provinces, how would this distribution occur? And so there was this horizontal division formula that were developed. Just this slide just shows the bottom three lines is the important one, which says of the national raised revenue, national government took 50%, provinces got 40%, local government 10%, and local government's 10% is not their real revenue. They raise 80% of their own revenue, so their contribution to services and goods and services are over 25% up to 26%. So it shows a fair, significant portion of the national budget going to provinces. Now, how was this division of this 40% of the national revenue divided amongst provinces? And here are the factors that were weighted factors in terms of which the revenue is divided. The latest for last 10 years, we see that education becomes a weighted 48%, and that is education of actually school-going population. Healthcare is number of persons not on medical aid or it's self-insurance. We don't have a general medical aid, it's private. And then a basic component, 16%, which are actual population figures. So the suggestion would be that population is not important, it is the services that are important. Economic activity is now only 1%, that is the activity in the province, and poverty only a measly 3%, and institutional component, which is equal to all 9 provinces, of 5%. Now, the question is, has this formula produced any significant change in the inequality between provinces? Now, the first, just look at this graph, we see, say, in the Eastern Cape, it's 11% of the population, it gets 13% of the income, or of the national revenue, which is, in the Eastern Cape, is very poor. You see the poverty level there of 52%. Of the top, of the bottom 40%, so high, very high level of poverty. Compare that with Gauteng, the heart, Johannesburg, the heart of our commerce and finance of the country. It's now 26% of the population, massive influx of people there, and it only gets 20%, much lower than its population figure, and that is then showing this contribution that Gauteng makes to the rest, to the funds that goes to the other provinces. The Western Cape here in the bottom, lowest poverty rate of 21%. Its population is 10.3, and it in fact receives slightly less than 10.3. So a marginal contributor to the general one. So the one argument that we're developing is that the formula doesn't deal with poverty. It's limited, but not interventionist enough to make a dent in inequality. So that will be the one reason for the continued provincial inequality that can be measured about the amount of money, the quality of education, the quality of medical care. Then provinces receive this block grant, their equitable share is entitlement, it's not a conditional grant, and so they can basically do with it what they like. And so the problem is that the expenditure by a province do not necessarily follow the weight given to its equitable share, so they can use not 48% of their budget goes to education, it could be less or even could be more. And then the last factor is then the incapacity of provinces to make effective use of their equitable share. It could be poor management or simply corruption, which is very high in the provinces. Horror stories coming out about a hospital just spending money on corrupt activities, fleeced to death, and obviously major impact on the quality of healthcare. Tanashi is going to look at what happens at local level.
Thank you very much, Nico, and a good afternoon to everyone. As Nico said, I'm going to focus on local government. The situation at provincial level when it comes to inequalities also mirrors what is at the local level. There are certain municipalities that are able to offer a high quality standards of services, and others that are so weak that they can't even provide the basic services. We're talking of refuse removal or even the supply of clean water. So we also have huge inequalities when it comes to access to services, and that's one of the reasons why myself and other colleagues decided to say, let's look at what could be the causes behind these inequalities, which seems to be entrenched, and yet the intergovernmental system is meant to minimize them. Let me just take you a little bit to this slide, which shows how the revenue that is generated annually is shared among the national government, provinces, and local government. So the starting point before we go to the sharing of revenue among municipalities is whether the share that they get from national government is enough. Because in South Africa, local government is not just about refuse removal and supply of water, it's much more. Municipalities are not only responsible for supplying public services, they are also responsible for socio-economic development. So their mandate is quite wide than you would find in many other countries. So obviously, if the mandate is wide, they require more resources to be able to deliver effectively on that mandate. If you look at the last three rows there, you will see that local government between 2018 and currently received less than 10% of national raised revenue. 8% in 2018 and 19, again 8%, again 2020, 2021, 8%. And it is only expected that from 2024, 2023, 2024, they are likely going to get 10% of what is shared amongst the three spheres of government. So you can already see that there's a big debate at the moment in the country whether what local government is given annually is equitable with regards to the mandate that they have. And of course, the picture is quite clear that the resources are fewer. They should probably receive more than 10%. Now let's go to whatever amount that they get, whether it's 8%, 9%, how is the 9% or 8% shared amongst the municipalities in South Africa? Currently, we have got 257 municipalities of different sizes. We have got your bigger cities, bigger metros, such as City of Cape Town and Johannesburg, and your very small municipalities that are very weak, which at most are able to raise only 20% of their revenue, which means they rely to the tune of 80% from resources that comes from the national government. So let's look at how the intergovernmental fiscal system is designed to address these inequalities. So the main instrument is the local government equitable share formula, which is the instrument that is used to equalize at the horizontal level. And this formula has gone through significant development from the late 1990s, where it was initially put in place. There, some of the basic objectives were to operationalize the current system of local government. So equity was not really a very strong objective in the early 2000s. And later on, the formula has been revised, and to the current extent that it is now more distributive than before. So in other words, there is more equity in its objective in as far as local government is concerned. Here are the basic features of the formula. The first part is that a certain portion of money is directed towards the delivery of basic services, so your water and municipal health. Another component is community services, so it is also meant to supply or to enable municipalities to deliver community services. And another component is the institutional funding, so that component is meant to enable even the weaker municipalities that are not able to raise revenue to have sufficient funds to operate. And then there is a revenue adjustment and correction and stabilization aspect, which all in all helps your weaker and smaller municipalities. So that's ideally what the formula seeks to achieve in as far as equity is concerned. This is what I was trying to explain. The old formula, you can see per household that the new formula, I think on your right here, you can see that your rural municipalities, which are often weak and poor, they are now receiving more in terms of from this equitable share than your metros and cities, which are well resourced. Some of them are able to raise around 75% from their own sources. Now, if rural municipalities are receiving more than metros and secondary cities, so which means they're getting more money, what explains the fact that in these municipalities there is no service delivery or service delivery is poor? What explains the fact that a person that stays in a city, for example, city of Cape Town, they've got a better quality of life in as far as access to water, electricity, and many other services is concerned than a person that is in a rural municipality? And we found answer in this table that we've put together. So from this table, what you see is we've targeted the first aspect of the formula, for instance, the delivery of free basic services. You will see that in terms of how the formula is designed, National Treasury, which is a national government department, estimates the number of poor households and the cost of delivery of services in a municipality. It then transfers a subsidy as an unconditional grant to every municipality to provide services to those poor households. On the other hand, municipality implements, in other words, they decide who qualifies to receive the free basic services, so which poor households deserve to get, a certain component of free water and free electricity, and it then delivers services to those households. In practice, there's a study that was carried out by Legend Company, and that study established that if we look at electricity, the National Treasury estimates that there are 10.1 million households that should receive free electricity. What happens in practice? If you look on the second column from your right, you will see that in practice, only 1.9 million of the households actually receive the free electricity. So it means that there's a difference of 8.2 million households that are not receiving electricity. If you look at sanitation, again, National Treasury estimates that 10.1 households must receive free sanitation. In practice, only 1.5 million households receive the free services in as far as sanitation is concerned, and the difference is 8.6 million. So what this table tries to share and also review is the fact that whilst National Treasury designs and funds equalization program, municipalities are excluding most poor households. So they are not giving the free services to the people that are supposed to benefit from them, and they are diverting the funds to other areas. So this explains why inequalities when it comes to services is widening instead of being reduced. In conclusion, inequality in South Africa persists due to a combination of reasons. This also applies to provinces and rural municipalities. The first one is that the economic circumstances of rural provinces and municipalities have worsened. So you can see that economic activities are becoming more and more concentrated in regions that are already rich, in municipalities that are already rich. We can also see that even though the provincial equitable share and local government equitable share formulas are designed to address inequalities, they are not interventionist enough. In other words, they are not making a real significant difference to reduce the growing inequalities. Then the last point that I just mentioned in the previous slide is that provinces and municipalities are using the unconditional grants for other purposes other than to people that actually deserve free basic services. Then the last crucial point is the fact that a majority or a substantial number of municipalities and most of the provinces, they are not really functioning as they should be. And some of the reasons around poor management and corruption are to explain why some of the resources that is supposed to go to the delivery of services is being channeled to other pockets. So this is in short our presentation on South Africa. It's work in progress, and we hope in the future we'll be able to get to the bottom of some of the reasons behind the growing inequalities besides the formula, because the formula is just one of the aspects. There could be many other reasons that are behind that. Thank you.
Thanks to all of speakers of this third session. And now it will be the turn for questions. Please try to keep it short because we are a little bit late in our schedule still. So,
In regard to South Africa, you said about the disparities in giving water, supplying water, electricity, and taking away refuse, etc. Now, South Africa has an excellent Bill of Rights, which recognizes social economic rights. And how have these rights been used by citizens in the constitutional, in courts, including the Constitutional Court, to address this question? So, I mean, through the judiciary.
For Eva Maria, if there was a negative competition over competencies, if some level of governance won that negative competition, is there any possibility to apply Anglo-Saxon principle of precedent legislature to cut them off, to take these competencies from them? If they do not want these competencies, to take them permanently? Because this is not the last crisis. This is not the first one, will not be the last one. If any level of governance is not willing to obtain some competencies, then give it to another one. And for Gisela, if I understood well, Bayern and Baden-Württemberg and Hessen are the best ones in the balance. That was. And for Nico and Tinashe, do you think that these disputes about these disparities which appeared in the last few years, are they on the relation center-periphery or between some competing centers like Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, or they're on the relation center of each state and the periphery, rural areas of each state? And do you think that all these disparities, regardless which of these answers is yes, can they take some political consequences? Can they cause some political, in the sense of competition between political parties or other political forces? Thank you.
yeah, I think.
My question is to Eva as well. Thank you for this presentation. I was wondering, this negative competencies crisis you're describing, do you think this is significantly different from, because federations are often criticized for having a slow response to crises, do you think this is something unique in Switzerland, what we observed? And would there be any merit in your view to compare it with the EU? I know the EU is not a traditional federation, but as a multi-level polity and also having had this very comparable competencies crisis. Thank you.
So maybe we'll start replying the questions and then we'll try to gather more of them. Maybe, Abamari, if you want
to. Yes, it's a very important one. The Bill of Rights says substantive equality. But it has been there's no litigation yet on the formula that this advances further or doesn't address discrimination. There has been one case, and one of our researchers at the Institute, actually her evidence won the case. And this was about policing in the city of Cape Town, which she showed followed the old apartheid way in which policing is done. Police stations were concentrated in the historical white areas, and in the big black areas there were one or two. And so she could show that per capita expenditure on police personnel in the poor areas were much lower than in the white areas. And so the court found, it was the Equality Court, which is a division of our Supreme Court, or of our High Court, could say the national policing policy in Cape Town is unconstitutional, is discriminatory. And for a variety of reasons, this decision wasn't upheld on appeal, but it was the beginning of showing systematic, structured discrimination. And I could well foresee that in time to come that you would say that the formula is not pursuing the goals of the Constitution of equalizing services. But as Natasha said, it's a combination of issues. You will have to isolate and say to what extent is a major and significant portion the formula and how they compose the components.
Thank you for the question. I will address the one on disparities. So the way it is at the moment is that there are disparities amongst your metros, amongst cities themselves, your secondary cities, but the marked difference is usually between your urban and rural areas. So that's where you've got the big differences. You know, the lifestyle that people have in urban areas and what people have in rural areas, you would think that's two different countries. Because, yeah, there's just a huge difference. And whether that has had any issues of political significance, the results of the elections thus far had not shown, because people, even in those areas where they are poor, they're unable to access services, they continue to vote for the ruling party. But the results of the last local government elections have shown that people are beginning to get tired with the ruling party. And for the first time in democratic era, we can see that the ruling party was brought closer to the 50%. And already at the moment, there's a possibility that when we have the next elections in 2024, it may even struggle to have 50% at national level. So in that way, we can say that the lack of service delivery, or the delivery of services that do not meet people's expectations, is beginning to have a political consequences, particularly for the ruling party. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Milan. If we understand concurrency as a system where two tiers of government are allowed to act, somehow most countries have developed, a federal system have developed a system of how to deal with positive conflicts. Well, if only one tier wants to act, fine. That is part of the innovative power of a federal system. if both want to act, we usually have a system, either preventive control, we try to sort it out through IGR, or subsequent control, usually do through constitutional review, in which the national tier usually wins if it acts within its constitutional competencies. But if the conflict is negative, we don't have instruments to sort that out. And I think that is, at least for my country, quite a new system. Because a court cannot really sort out the conflict because you don't have a clash of norms. And I think that brings me to the second question. I think it is not an issue of speed or slowness. I think it's more profound as a problem. And we would find the same issue in the European Union, but also globally. It's almost a shortcoming, not just of a federal system, of the world system more generally, because to sort out global problems, basically it's a concurrency problem, and the incentives not to act are strong. And we tend to think that it's a democratic deficit because of generation issue. You're responsible for now the living generation and not for the next, but it's also a demographic issue. You want to be re-elected by your own constituency, so why make investments into a service that profits the entire world? So I think it's a real issue, negative conflicts. And I think in this crisis and in all the other crises, we see the negative effects.
Well, let me just add here that Germany missed that problem of the negative competence conflict just by inventing a new decision structure. And the federation took up the money and covered all the costs, and a lot of the costs the state had, and even local governments. But in Germany, in the past, the conference of the minister presidents, of the heads of the states, they came together 1 or twice a year just to have talks on negotiation, on cooperation, but it's not an official decision-making institution. That is the Bundesrat, the technical chamber, but they preside the groups of the Bundesrat. And in the pandemic crisis, the minister president and the chancellor of the republic, the federal and the state, made decision together in the same meeting. They met and negotiated, and the federation in most of the time took the money. And therefore, for Switzerland, I have the questions: why did the federation in Switzerland not take the money and covered what was necessary to do? So, as in other countries, in most federal countries, the federation took over the cost. Why not in Switzerland? So, Milan, you asked me the reasons for the disparities in Germany. I think there are two of them which dominate everything. The one is the geographical and the settlement structure of the different states. That means we have the city-states by their own important agglomerations with a high service sector in economic structure, and they are the growth poles. The agglomerations are the most growing areas in Germany. And they are not distributed evenly. They are more in the west, in the south, and in the region of Hamburg. And the only growing area in eastern Germany is around Berlin, and not so strongly maybe in Saxony, but you don't see it, because Saxony, meanwhile, even despite the immigration to Germany, loses population year by year after the winds in 2015 by the immigration of the refugees. So that is one. And the second, or what I learned, even the expenditures of federal government, and you know they have the biggest budget in the Federal Republic of Germany, and beside the transfer payments to social securities, and even we analyzed the effects, the regional effects on the expenditures of federal budgets and social insurances. And we found out, if you continue to follow this, they will have a program to economic development in Eastern Germany, for example. What comes later? They hire personnel, they buy investment products, they build streets, and so on. In the end, after all multipliers, the demands effect, where do this money and the multipliers come to which type of regions? To the agglomerations. It's not so that money spent to Eastern Germany does not remain in Eastern Germany. There is an effect on the production capacities, on the productivity, on the modernity of the infrastructure. But the demand effects just influence a growth effect in the agglomerations, wherever they are located. That means, in the end, the money goes to Munich, to Hamburg, to Berlin, to Düsseldorf, to Frankfurt and Stuttgart. So this is one effect, and we can, whatever you do, you will have this effect on the growth poles. And the second, I think, continuing structural economic change, the shrinking region, the regions with the shrinking industries are burdened for many, many years. I looked for what happened in the Saarland after the coal and mining crisis of the 60s and 70s, continuing even after all the enterprises were locked down, were closed. The effects of the close down continues because I learned that the specific infrastructure, that means streets, railway, even the disciplinary orientation of the schools are oriented on the old industries. And it takes a lot of time to get them to modern things and costs a lot of money. In the Saarland, it took about 50 years to give them a new structure, and now they have new problems of the old style. And well, we have 30 years of reunification in Germany, and we have put billions of euros to Eastern Germany. I always made the joke, I go to Eastern Germany and will have a look what they did with my money. But I found out it was invested excellently. It was good that we did that. But it takes time. They have a structure as rural regions. They don't have big agglomeration. Therefore, they have lower salaries. They have even lower prices for housing and other. I don't know whether there are so big differences with regard to real prices among the regions. This is not analyzed in Germany. Sometimes I think that the government's funding of research is not interested to have a look into this question. And therefore, I cannot find out any political reason or any reasons of political competition. That state government, that mayor who is not interested to invest in employment and jobs and in good economic structure will not win the next elections. Therefore, all have an interest in this issue. And therefore, I don't think it's an issue of political competition, but it's, well, governments may differ with good luck or bad luck, invest in the decisions they make to help for structural economic change.
So we can continue the conversation in a few minutes during the coffee break, but first, please, two things that we want to remind you. First, we are going to take the picture of the family picture now, before anybody leaves. And also, please remember that those attending tomorrow's trip to Guernica, talk to my colleague, Xavi. He will be, during the coffee break, in order to collect the contribution that has to be made in order to attend that one. Thanks. We'll come back in 10 to 15 minutes for the second half of the session.
Ja, aber Sie haben lange gebraucht, bis Sie einen Arsch hochbekommen.
Ja, weißt du, Federal Minister of Finance.
Ja, das habe ich ja erwartet, als du das erzählt
Der
hast.
ist ein Typ Trump oder Bolsonaro. Ja.
Entschuldigung.
So we will resume the third session. Oye, falta gente. Falta gente. ¿Dónde está Miquel? We'll resume the third session with the second half of it. And just will be the last part of the conference before the ending and the closure. So I'll give the floor to our first speaker.
I'm going to come here, maybe I can stand. All right, so I'll give you permission to stop me at 10 minutes and I'll abort. So the paper that I wrote with colleagues that's linked to my talk is written with Daniel Belin from McGill and Trevor Toom, an economist from the University of Calgary, and it's for actually for an interesting volume, collective volume called Policy Success. Oxford has these handbooks on policy success in this country, that country. And when we were asked to write that, it was interesting because equalization is not really talked about as a success typically in the Canadian media. But when you think about it, it kind of is with some qualifiers. So we called it equalization as a controversial and as a controversial policy success. So I think, how can it be a success, equalization in Canada? Why can we say that? Well, first of all, it does what it's supposed to do from a policy perspective, right? So it enables provincial governments to deliver public services of comparable quality at a comparable level of taxation. So it does that. And from a political perspective, despite the fact that there's, a lot of complaining, you would say, about equalization from a province or two, there's strong public opinion support for the program, for the principles of the program, certainly, as there is strong support from the Canadian political class for the program. So now it's contested because certainly in the province of Alberta especially, there's a feeling that equalization is unfair because Alberta never benefits from it, and also because it, in an indirect way, it would, is the theory, take the oil revenues of Alberta, and in Canada, natural resources are the exclusive property of provinces. It would take these revenues and funnel them towards other provinces, right? So what I want to tell you about today basically is, why is it that it's a success and why is it that it's contested, right? I think in terms of explaining why equalization is a success, part of it is agency, right? So there's been some very important actors in institutionalizing equalization in Canada. It's actually the baby, if you will, of a very unheralded Canadian Prime Minister, Louis Saint-Laurent, and then much better known Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau wrote it in the Constitution in 1982, where all provinces agreed to constitutionalize the principle of equalization, right? So the Canadian Constitution reads that the federal government commits to making equalization payments, but it doesn't exactly detail how that will take shape, right? So, of course, you can't eliminate equalization in Canada. It's constitutionalized, and of course, to change the Canadian Constitution requires unanimity on something like that. So it's here to stay. Another key to its success is that it's adaptable, right? So, the formula, the basic structure of equalization in Canada has not changed since the program was initially designed in 1957. So basically, the federal government calculates a fiscal capacity for each province, right? So it looks at how much revenue would a province be able to generate at a given level of taxation, a hypothetical one, right? It then establishes a national average, and all provinces that fall below this average are taken to that very average. The provinces that are over are just left alone, right? So it's a fairly basic, fairly simple structure. Now, the federal government has been able through the years to adapt the formula, right? So, for example, the number of provinces that have been used to calculate fiscal capacity, sometimes it's been 2, sometimes it's been 5, sometimes it's been 10, right? And why is that done? Well, you can guess that, when the program gets too expensive for the federal government, right, then there's, you change the number of provinces that are part of this calculation of fiscal capacity, right? For example, you eliminate Alberta, right? There's also the question of natural resources that it's been played with, right? So natural resources, sometimes the revenues from natural resources have been fully considered, and sometimes they've been only considered at 50%, as is the case today. So I think, again, there's sometimes a lack of principle there, but I think adaptability has meant that the program has been resilient. Now, it's also been contested. It's a contested program. So why is that? I guess when I started doing research on this about 12 years ago, a civil servant had told me, if we had no oil in Canada, we would have no controversy around equalization. It's pretty much it. that pretty much says it all. So the issue with oil, of course, is that it's oil in Canada. Well, Canada is the 4th largest oil producer in the world, by the way, right? So we can start with that. And most of it is in one province, in Alberta, with a secondary province of Saskatchewan having also a decent oil production, and then Newfoundland much less so. So the discrepancies territorially in Canada, they stem from oil, essentially. Now, to complicate things, again, our Constitution states that natural resources are owned by provinces and that the revenues from natural resources are the provinces alone, right? So in the West, equalization, as I said before, is viewed as something that really implicitly takes oil revenues and redistributes them to the rest of the provinces. And it's complicated in Western Canada because that's embedded in a sentiment that's called in the literature Western alienation. So there's a sense in the West that the Western provinces lack political clout in the federation, that they lack power, that Canada is a federation that essentially serves the interests of Ontario and Quebec, right? And that's kind of politically actualized by the fact that Western provinces tend to vote conservative at the federal level, and Canada is almost always governed by the Liberal Party of Canada, right? So you have kind of these levels of conflict there that congeal around equalization. And last year, some of you might know that the Alberta government decided to hold a referendum on abolishing the equalization program in the country, which it can't do, but had a referendum on it. And we can talk more about it during the Q&A period. And then I'll finish with this issue of adaptability, or the other side of the coin, right? So adaptability, I think, has helped equalization remain, but at the same time, it's led to views of equalization as being political and politicized. And, I think there's some truth to that. It's probably over-exaggerated, in a province like Alberta, but there's certainly a sense that, the federal government has some political agendas, I think some people would say, when it comes to equalization. So I have a strongly held view in provinces like Alberta and in Saskatchewan, which of course is helped by the fact that in Canada, the federal government is the sole owner and operator of the equalization program. So, I'll finish by, again, repeating, I don't like to give policy advice a lot, but on this I have with my colleague Daniel Bélan, we really like the Australian way of governing equalization, which is through an arm's length agency which serves to at least remove the appearance of politicization of the program. But unfortunately, nobody in Canada will listen to us, in part because, well, the provinces don't want to do that because they know they have leverage with the federal government. So if we go the technocratic way, the arm's length agency way, they lose this leverage, so they all hate it, except for Ontario. And then the federal government, well, doesn't like this idea either. It's been examined many times, including at the birth of the program, where a very famous Australian came to recommend the Australian model. But I think the idea is that Canada is such a decentralized federation, the federal government doesn't have a lot of levers, right, to manage the federation. Equalization is one of those few levers, and it just doesn't want to abandon it. So that's it. I'm going to stop.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to follow André. He set a model of concision. I will try to respect that. I'm not sure if I will be as good. And he also presented Canada from a sort of an optimistic point of view. And I will do that too, to a point. I have my limits. But the title of the talk is Canada, the Uneven Return of Redistributive Politics. You will see also some themes that were addressed by Olivier Jacques yesterday. We will come across these at the same time. My starting point is a book that was released now 10 years ago, a book in which I had a chapter on Quebec politics. And Keith Banting and John Miles, who were the editors, summarized the situation. Well, the title said The Fading of Redistributive Politics, so that was the main observation of the book at the beginning of the 2010, not so long ago. Quotation, the Canadian redistributive fade was among the most dramatic in the OECD world, and Canada became a poster child for retrenchment. So the argument of Banting and Miles was that redistribution in Canada was doing badly, that there had been serious cutbacks in social programs, and that few countries were as harsh and tough as Canada in this respect, and they referred in particular to cuts in social transfers to the provinces, cuts in unemployment/employment insurance, as it is called in Canada, and social assistance in the provinces in particular. So my argument is that we've moved from there, that we have returned to redistributive politics, or to say it another way, the fading of redistributive politics is fading. To place things in context, and not to, this is data that many Canadians are not aware of. Canadians like to think that their country has a generous welfare state, largely because they compare it to the US, just south. Here are data from the OECD for 2019, so just before the COVID crisis. And Canada, for social expenditures as a percentage of GDP, stands below the OECD average and even stands below the US, which was a hard one to observe. There were Canadian scholars who disputed the OECD data and said there must be a mistake, something was, and I talked to people at the OECD, and there was no mistake, really. One factor, I won't spend too much time on this because time is flying, but one thing we know is that we are a big spender on healthcare. Not as much as the US, and not as much as France. By the way, France is first on everything regarding social protection in terms of spending. But Canada spends a lot on healthcare, largely because healthcare is costly in Canada, but spends very little, Olivier mentioned that yesterday, much less than others on pensions. And that explains a large part of the ranking of Canada, because together, healthcare and pensions are the big ticket items. They are the bulk of what we do in social protections. So we have more private pensions. The pension system in Canada is relatively egalitarian in the sense that it provides a good floor, preventing poverty in old age very well. But it's not a big public commitment. This is new, and it's a hint of where I'm going. For transfers to working age adults between 18 and 65, Canada is doing much better than the OECD average, and that's new. It was not like that a few years when Benting and Miles wrote their book. So this has changed, and one way to see it is to look at the trends in the 2000s. What we have on top are the two big ticket items. So the top one is healthcare. This is expenditures as a percentage of GDP, all our orders of government considered, so provinces plus the federal government. So spending on healthcare is stable, basically at a high level. Spending on pension is also relatively stable at a high level, increasing a little bit largely because of demographics. Spending on on transfers to persons is decreasing, so less spending on unemployment insurance, on social assistance, on benefits related to incapacity. But, and this is explained in part because there's less unemployment now than there was. But what we see, the red line, is transfers to family, and that's where the return of redistributive politics is located. The Trudeau government, after being elected in 2015, revamped transfers to families for children and really made a big difference in terms of child poverty and inequality. Another way to put it, to see it, and that's, to me, a very interesting representation of what happened. What you see, this is program expenditures, so it's not only social expenditures, it's all expenditures by all governments in Canada in recent years. And what you see is, here is the fading of redistributive politics, in a sense, less government spending in the beginning, in the late 90s and beginning of the 2000s. And then the first bump up was associated with the general financial crisis of 2008, and the second bump up, of course, is COVID. And this is sort of a U-turn that is significant. Anton Emmerich, who is a specialist of social protection in the OECD, says the welfare state was the unsung hero of the financial crisis and the COVID crisis, and protected population. And that's what happened in Canada to a large extent. So there was a U-turn in program spending, including social spending, but transfers, and that's what Olivier discussed yesterday, transfers to provinces did not go up. They recovered, but they did not go up as much, and equalization did not even recover. So that's why I talk about an uneven return of redistributive politics, is that the federal government is more committed to redistribute using programs it controls and manages and sending money to individual Canadian households, but less keen on improving transfers to the provinces, who are responsible notably for healthcare and social assistance, and who do less for this. The result, nevertheless, even if it's an uneven return, the result is nevertheless positive in terms of inequality. Here you have market income and post-tax income Gini index for Canada in recent years. The relevant line here is the bottom line. And what you see is a decline of the Gini index. And I don't have the slide for this, but there is a decline of poverty also. And in the year 2020, for which we have data, was particularly remarkable. So the COVID crisis really contributed to reduce poverty and inequality in Canada. It probably won't last, but that reflects the strengthened intervention of governments. Just for context, very, very briefly, Canada, in terms of inequality, so the Gini index, starts from a relatively equal, the Canadian labor market produces relatively even results, and the Canadian state doesn't redistribute all that much, but end up with an equality picture not so bad. I'll skip the next one. I'll skip the next one on provinces. Well, no, just to mention that provinces are at different places in terms of inequality and in terms of poverty. So that's poverty measured by a Canadian measure for Canadian province for children or all persons. And so the provinces, even though they are constrained by a tighter situation with less transfers, have obtained different results largely because they do different things. And that's my last slide, actually. And what you have here you see there's a U-turn less pronounced than for all governments in Canada, but nevertheless. The gray line is Quebec. It's the province that spends the most on program expenditures in general and in social protection in particular, and obtains better results regarding poverty. So there is room for maneuver in the provinces, and I will end with that. In the last 4 years, the Quebec government increased social spending and began to reduce taxes. And so that means that the constraints on provincial governments are real, but they're not making it impossible to move. And that's, Olivier yesterday referred to Paul Pearson's permanent austerity. And I would say as a word of conclusion that austerity was not so permanent and not so austere than what maybe we think. Thank you very much.
Hello, hi everyone. My name is Kinga Karani from the Heritage School. I'm following this tradition of also talking about Canada, but I will also talk about the European Union. So first, I want to talk to you a bit about my broader project, which is my dissertation focusing on negotiations in fiscal redistribution, in which I develop a theory for framing in fiscal redistribution negotiations. This is in my first paper that I sent around, and this will be the basis, and I'm trying to further test this theory in my EU case studies that I will talk about later. So the background is that these negotiations in federations or multi-level polities are quite asymmetrical. I categorize actors as either contributors or recipients. Of course, this is not such a clear-cut line in all cases, but I can see this in, for example, in Canada. So dividing budgets is quite a divisive process, and I would think that contributors have more powers to leverage because they simply are not in such a great need to, they want to cut their contributions, and that is not such an existential threat as we see for recipients who want to, of course, maximize their gains or improve the conditionalities attached to the funding that they receive. So my question is, how can fiscally weak subunits alter the dynamics and substance of fiscal redistribution negotiations to maximize their gains? Now, I looked at two different strands of literature to try to pave a way for my own understanding of this. The first is this small states literature. Mostly, I don't know if you guys are familiar, Diana Panka writes a lot about this. Small states in the European Union can rely on argumentation strategies, their reputation, perhaps neutral reputations, the fact that they have institutional overrepresentation, and because of this, they make for excellent coalition partners. This may be true for small states, but when we look at multi-level polities, these strategies might not apply. Then we have weak actors in international negotiations, such as climate negotiations. One image that comes to my mind very strongly is the Maldives held an underwater cabinet meeting, the Maldives government in 2009, and this sparked international outrage. So the idea that these weak countries in international negotiations can use argumentation and framing brought me to my framing theory in fiscal redistribution negotiations. Now, framing is understood as the mode of selecting and emphasizing certain aspects of a perceived reality or dimension of an issue and communicating these arguments, so to pave way for a power shift in negotiation. I'm not trying to say that framing explains all outcomes in negotiation, but it is a composite explanation. I'm trying to isolate these factors. So I do understand that coalition formation or enlisting third-party, honest brokers, neutral actors are also strategies that subunits can rely on. And I admit that even in my cases, some of these coexist, but I'm trying to look exclusively at framing. So there are two modes of issue emphasis. The first is a more communitarian framing approach, which means tapping into feelings of solidarity. We are all members of the same country after all. We are all Canadians, or we're all Swiss, we're all Europeans, or we are very poor, or we're referring back to a previous crisis, and because of that we deserve this kind of leveling off, this equality now. This ties into ideas of normative suasion, so genuinely trying to convince the contributors or the federal government that this is a deserving matter to increase the funding. Also, this can work by the logic of normative entrapment, because there is a certain logic of appropriateness in well, let's look at the Canadian Federation. It is constitutionally mandated that some form of equalization must take place. So this is a commonly accepted, appropriate mode in that given country. So politicians have already made remarks, they've made commitments. It is quite embarrassing to go back on their word, quite frankly. So this is the idea of normative entrapment here. And then there's also coercive framing, which is very outright shaming, blaming, threatening. The threats can go even so far as to threaten secession. Of course, this happens rarely, but to allude to that. It is outright hostility that is then unleashed on other members of the Federation. And so this is a very aggressive strategy. Now, in terms of the communication of these frames, this can take place either via very high publicization, which we barely see because, to be frank, we don't often see the general public engaged in fiscal redistribution negotiations, so commonly that we see this in the press and so forth. So this can also take place as low publicization or in closed-door negotiations. So negotiating to avoid confiscatory equalization in Canada. So as we have just mentioned in the past two presentations, oil is a big issue in Canada. And in the early 2000s, certain provinces, like two Atlantic provinces, Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador, and Saskatchewan, became aware of the fact that they were being subjected to confiscatory equalization. Because of their oil revenues, they were basically losing out on equalization funds because the resource revenues were calculated into the equalization formula at the time. So all of the three governments, and I've treated Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador as one case because they acted quite in unison from the start of the negotiations. I do understand here is one of the cases where framing is not the only variable of explanation, but the coalition also mattered. But so they pursued a certain course of action, which was that first they tried a communitarian framing. We are all Canadians, this is unfair, we will be cold in the winter, very vocal images. And then they became incrementally more coercive, and they actually even, the premier of Newfoundland, Danny Williams, actually removed Canadian flags from government buildings. And there was even, I recall, a bathing suit brand that discontinued the selling of any bathing suit with the Canadian flag on it. So there was quite this coercive tactic. In the end, I will show kind of differences of their negotiation strategy with Saskatchewan. They were successful. To premise this, they also started from a more disadvantageous place than Saskatchewan, which tried a communitarian approach first. Very similarly, we are poor, we will be cold in the winter, and this communitarian strategy actually prompted Ottawa to offer a deal. Mind you, it wasn't as advantageous of a deal, but it was an offset payment deal. Saskatchewan declined, and then went on to adopt this very inconsistent mixture of the coercive strategy with very, very high publicization. They unleashed this 2-week ad campaign, and then they also went back to communitarian at the end because they were trying to isolate their actions, and they actually said that we're not lowering the flag as Newfoundland and Nova Scotia did, we are raising the flag in solidarity with being Canadian, but that's the way they tried to show their need for more funding. And this was actually seen as greedy and insincere, and they got no deal. Now, of course, so this is pretty small, I think, if you're sitting in the back row. This just covers what I discussed, that the relative fiscal position was a little bit different because the Atlantic provinces were in a much weaker position than Saskatchewan, which wasn't always a recipient, actually, of the equalization funds at the time. Then we have what is definitely notable is the consistency of the strategy. So as we see, the Atlantic provinces were incrementally more coercive, which proved trustworthy and it was credible, the threat. and Saskatchewan was inconsistent. Also, the goal in the beginning was not clear from Saskatchewan's side. So the takeaways from this first paper of mine is that discursive tools can pave way for efficient negotiations. There is utility of using solidaristic public argumentation, and that I see that normative entrapment, as well as a consistent then building to a coercive framing strategy, can be seen as a credible threat. This is what the Atlantic provinces did. At the same time, relative starting positions matter, as we've seen, and recipient units need to be realistic, and they need to be consistent, and they need to understand the logic of appropriateness that is not just within the federation, that they deserve some sort of fiscal redistribution, but understanding their own roles within that and applying demands that are consistent and matching with what is appropriate for them, quite frankly. And the more is not the better. This is not true for these types of negotiations. It is not the case that more publicity and more aggressive strategy yields better results. And this is also an ongoing series of negotiations. So actors such as Saskatchewan in this case, they need to be aware of the fact that these actions will be remembered. And this is a continuous process. So very briefly, I'm trying to transpose this and looking at the Next Generation EU negotiations. The premise here is not fiscally weak states per se, but EU member states that want something. And I'm thinking of looking at Italy and Spain and how they use this communitarian strategy, the ideas of solidarity with us, the fact that you mistreated us in the previous crisis, therefore we deserve some sort of leveling off, and overall this is better for the EU, so the ideas of integrative bargaining were very much tapped into by these member states. And they received a successful outcome, I would say, because the harsh conditionalities that were initially proposed that Italy did not want were scrapped. As well, this is the first time we can see a shift of funding from east to the south, because with the multi-annual financial framework, with the cohesion policy payments, ever since the eastern countries joined, there has been a per capita eastern shift versus the southward funding. On the other hand, you have certain actors like Hungary and Poland, which relied on a very coercive strategy. Their goal was not necessarily to maximize the funding, which they wanted to as well, to be clear. Their goal was to take away the rule of law conditionality. So whereas Italy and the southern member states succeeded in stripping away certain conditionalities, we can see that the eastern states did not, and they used very, very coercive strategies. Prime Minister Viktor Orban said that this is punishment, this is political poison, and so forth. There was even a brief movement of hung exit that gained momentum then. So why did the communitarian framing produce successful negotiation outcomes, whereas coercive framing could not? And what other types of frames were utilized, and which ones were successful? I'm exploring this. And so I'm very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this overall project, and thank you very much.
So the next speaker will be Florencia Martino, that will present the work of Miguel Ángel Asensio and Pamela Jessica Fadul also. Can you, Florencia, connect your slides? If you want to share them, you can do it now. We can see your slides, but we don't see them in full screen.
Can you see our slides?
Yeah, but please, if you can make them to look into full screen. Now it's perfect.
Okay. Well, good day, good evening for all of you. It is a great pleasure and honor to come back in this way to this very important encounter, to see among the public many of the companions in the Institute of International Studies for Federalism. prepared for this event. Many thanks for your help and for the preparation what we effort in organizing this conference. So we are presenting with Florencia here and Pamela here at my left. We are presenting with the approval of Dr. Fernandez of the Institute of Federalism in Córdoba, and us collaborating from Santa Fe here in the National University of Bilbao. We are presenting the problem of territorial disparities and horizontal imbalances in the case of Ituna, thinking that we arrive to new evidences in terms of statistical data for measuring the differences, very big differences among regions and provinces. We present this study in a format not extremely different, but with its particularities, with the study presented in Freiburg 5 years ago, with the organization of the University of Freiburg, where it was possible to speak about the regional and provincial differences in Argentina, differences which are in the root of the differences in fiscal terms. So if we speak about economic differences, we can speak after this about fiscal differences. In such a way, we think that the economic horizontal imbalance is the mother or the father of the fiscal imbalance. So we need to get a measure, updated measure of such imbalances, and getting also issue of the fiscal imbalance. Argentina presents acute regional differences and politics and regions and policies, which we have considered in other states, for example, the state of Switzerland, but also what the state in Montreal more years ago. But here, modeling period until in this paper, in this presentation, we attempt to solve the lack of statistics in the first fifth of this century, considering the gap. The objective of the research is to show some new evidences for Argentina about the quantity of the regional and provincial imbalances and evaluate some of its implications in the economic, political, and federal fiscal field. And of course, to highlight some of the main challenges which emerge from the practical research obtained in the frontier research. Of course, the limitations are the remaining lack of central updated data and statistics completely combined with our common sense that use of territorial and regional research with economic and fiscal goals. The solution that we attempt to reach is to adopt some alternative measures like the estimation of the cost of geographical provincial product using a new base published by the National Institute of Statistics and Census that we, of course, follow in this presentation. Well, I think that we can explain our strategy for getting an investigation for the geographical provincial and regional GDP in the case of Argentina. And we have employed a consumption of electricity index for economic uses, plus an index for consumption of cement, and then other index, third index of registered workers for working in the private sector, thinking that the economic adjustment is acceptable, is correct. For reading the last GDP base, official base, for getting after peak GDP base in the year following, some of the years between 2004 and the year 2018. 2018 was particularly the last year prior to the pandemic event in 2020. So the result that we can show yours as in the first place the geographic gross domestic product for the regions, 5 regions, the Pacific one, Puyo, Patagonia, and northwest and northeast, 5 regions in our country. Remember that the surface of our country in the world is 2.8 million square kilometers. So it is a problem as such to get acceptable compound of separate regions. And across this estimation, we can see that in the blue line, that the Pampean one, with the very, very big weight along the years, maintains a relevant position with the other regions lesser positions. Then among the last, the Patagonian one, occupying the second place. So you see again the weight of the regions across other diagrammatic models. It is possible to see that in blue again, the Pacific one, includes of course the normal part of the science, continues to be the most important in general way. But if you see with attention, with a very, very few deduction in its way, in this sense, we have maintained the same results. So, 5 years ago, the event of fiber, 2 years ago, 3, after the validation of the other the second place in 2019 continues to be for the Patagonian region. And then it is interesting to see some interesting behavior in the wake of the Northwest region, which awaits superior to Europe. So if we try to see which is the result in terms of per capita dimension of situation, it is possible to see that usually the Patagonian one is bigger than the Pangea one because of the incidence of population. In terms of provincial GDP, it is possible to see that the average Ecuador in the southern extreme has a per capita income superior to the autonomous city of Buenos Aires, and traditionally is called the richest place in the country, following the
Excuse me, Miguel Angel, is a couple of minutes more, but we need to go for the next presentation. Thanks.
In such a way, there was realized a data of electricity consumption by economic sector, semi-construction, and among registered workers in the private sector. Considering that the information for economic electricity consumption was available until the year 2016, including for the province. It was estimated of the year 2017-2019 by million per hectare of time system.
very many times. Bye-bye. I'm Grace from Argentina.
Thank you, Miguel Angel. Before we go for the discussion, is the turn of Govinda Bhattacharjee from the Center for Multi-Level Federalism from India. Govinda? Okay, perfect. We can see your slides, but if you can click on full screen. Yeah. That's it, perfect. You can start, thanks.
subsuming them all into the GST. For this, both the centre and the states had agreed to sacrifice their respective powers under the constitution to levy those taxes separately to a newly created GST council on the promise of compensation to states by the union government for the next 5 years. As the pandemic ravaged the finances of the union too, it reneged on this promise, creating strain in the federal fiscal relations. Here again, the poorer states suffered more as the pandemic had dried their already scarce revenue resources. Now, GST was a unique experiment in cooperative federalism and a successful one. But a recent Supreme Court judgment also introduced some uncertainty by asserting the rights of individual states over the collective decision-making process inherent in the GST framework. The ruling was against the spirit of cooperative cooperation that has so far guided the working of the GST Council. Over and above, the constitutional mechanism for devolution of resources mediated by a finance commission also faltered, with its emphasis more on the fiscal rather than the federal. The report of the latest commission, the 15th, attracted wide criticism because the criteria used and the formula applied to determine the shares of respective states seem to favor those with high population to the disadvantage of poorer small states who needed more support. In a sign of increased fiscal vulnerability of the states, as many as 17 of the 28 Indian states were identified by the 15th Finance Commission as revenue deficit states, as against only 11 identified with the previous Finance Commission. The fiscal responsibility legislation enacted by the Indian states also imposed a borrowing limit of 3% of the respective state GDPs on them, restricting the ability of the poorer states to create additional capital assets through borrowing, which is necessary for faster and higher growth. Now, the centralization of fiscal federal relationship has always been a problem in India, with the centre encroaching upon states' jurisdictions through the centrally sponsored schemes, financed largely by the centre and implemented in the states. The numbers and allocations are always on the rise, while they make the states increasingly dependent on central financing. The pandemic had differentiated impacts on health, economic and fiscal parameters across states, districts, and cities, with only 8 states accounting for nearly 70% of the total caseload. The shocks created with the pandemic exposed multiple structural inefficiencies and asymmetries in the third tier of the government, with the local bodies, which are the weakest links in India's federal structure. Faced with the severity and spread of the pandemic across localities, especially during April to June 2021, they were overwhelmed by severe resource and capacity constraints. The 15th Finance Commission tried to address some of these issues by recommending substantially higher transfers of funds to the third tier of the government, but the capacity constraints they suffer from are not addressable in the short term. Post-pandemic, states are now much more dependent on federal financing. 7 million net jobs are estimated to have been lost between February 2020 and February 2021, the largest by non-farm workers, followed by salaried employees and daily wage earners, as a result of stalled economic activities that forced millions of migrant workers to move to rural areas from the cities and towns where they were working on low-paid jobs without any social security. Poverty increased as people lost jobs, adding an estimated additional 200 million to the number of existing poor. One estimate indicates a 15% increase in poverty incidence at 5% of contraction in consumption. The numbers of poor increased much more in poorer states, which already had higher incidence of poverty. The higher incidence of poverty can be directly correlated to the lack of growth in most Indian states which suffered severely from the pandemic. As you can see from the table, in the fiscal year 2021, as many as 24 out of the 28 Indian states suffered from negative growth, as against only 1 in the previous fiscal. Only 4 states in the fiscal 2021 had positive growth, and that too below 5%. To conclude, the pandemic has not only accentuated poverty inequality across the states in India, it also brought the structure of cooperative federalism under great strain. The success of fiscal federalism in a diverse country like India obviously depends on the application of asymmetric federal principles to the fiscal system. It also needs support from an appropriate fiscal architecture to allow fiscal space for such exogenous shocks. To meet the shock of another pandemic-like crisis, the public financial management system also needs to improve vastly on the accuracy of data and reporting, backed by an updated fiscal architecture with an independent fiscal council, which has been recommended by all finance commission, but not acted on yet by the government. We cannot just afford to let this crisis go waste. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Govind. And with you, we finish this last session of the conference. Is the turn of the questions. So if anyone has a question, can raise their hand, and John will. Vale. So here I think I saw a raised hand.
Thank you. Well, I have a general question. Actually, I was going to make it in the previous panel, but it's the same issue. So, aren't we asking too much to equalization? I mean, the way in which I see equalization is not to cure inequality, is to make the effects of inequality milder, you know. Inequality and disparities are the result, Gisela was explaining very well, of structural elements of the economy. So they're there to stay, in a sense. Okay, they've been there for a long time. So the effect of disparities is creating different fiscal capacity. Andre was mentioning that, and equalization is just about leveling these differences in fiscal capacity. So equalization is about reducing the burdens of disparities, not avoiding or preventing them. That's something for public policies, for next generation EU is a good example of how you try to cure disparities. So this is just food for thought here. Are we asking too much to equalization, and when we link it to disparities? Thank you.
I'm going to first, before the rest of the questions are posed, I'm going to develop of Andrea's question, because I think this is really an interesting topic. I think that sometimes even in literature we mixed up the objectives of fiscal equalization, which has been explained here for Canada, that is supposed to provide similar levels of public services, local public services and goods, and regional policy, which is the structural funds and so on, next generation funds that are supposed to close the gap on terms of per capita, income per capita terms, no? So I remember a few months ago we hosted a seminar on this issue, and our experts defended some of them that they were different objectives, so why not using different tools, as Gisela explaining for Germany, where these regional policy objectives were taken by the VAT, no? So I'm going to take advantage of this question and ask you, do you think that these both policy objectives should be differentiated, should be treated by different policy tools also? So I think there were more questions there.
Okay, thank you very much. My own question is very specific. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. My own question is very specific, and is for Andre. In your presentation, you said in Canada, provinces own resources, especially oil resources. So my simple question is, do they share oil-generated revenue, for example, with the federal center? Thank you.
Thank you. My question is actually for the Canadian gang, so the three of them can answer. Because equalization was introduced also, and Andrea, I know he has worked on this, as also a way to integrate Quebec. And actually, François Legault referred to equalization as our reason to be a proud Canadian, and part of the original deal of confederation, although we know it's not. But it's creating problems on the other side, on the west, a slap in the face for Alberta. But on the other hand, and I think Alain Noel also showed that equalization in the end it's not that big as a transfer in Canada, but it's increasingly controversial, and there's a lot of politicization about that. But it's not about the CHT or the CST, they are much bigger transfers. So I would like if you could elaborate on this and on this issue. And I have one comment for Kinga, because I think you were referring on your very last slide to the EU and how some countries were successful in achieving, getting some of their demands granted by the EU. And you could also look at, in the case of Spain and Portugal, the price cap that was imposed on gas in order to lower electricity prices. And because, of course, this has a problem on the European market, so they need permission from the EU to do this. Germany was always against this. The Netherlands were always against this also. And finally, both countries got it. So this price cap on the price of gas when generating electricity. So they were also successful in lobbying the European Union in getting this concession. So maybe it would also be interesting for you, for your case. Thank you.
John, Tracy had a question also. We'll take that. Also. Yeah. Okay. Well, Milan, maybe. Yeah.
For Andre, that referendum in Alberta or Manitoba, I forgot. Is it already held, or they will just have to hold it? And if yes or no, whatever, is it are the results obligatory in legal sense or just consultative? And for Kinga, just simple question: who during these negotiations you covered, who ruled over Atlantic provinces and who ruled over Saskatchewan? Which party? And who held the federal government? Thank you.
We're taking the last question before giving the voice to the table. Yeah.
Hi. My question's for Alain. So, Alain, I wrote a book in 2016 called Avoiding Governors, and the central argument of that book is that the political willingness in robust federations, which Canada is one, of the central government to expand social protection spending is dependent on their ability to credit claim. And that argument's dependent on the conditional factors, which are, does the central government have the ability to bypass the provinces when they design those programs? And so the reason I bring it up is watching your presentation, I felt like you just basically wrote avoiding premiers social expansion policy in kind of the post-2015 period in Canada, because the expansion you showed, and contradicting what Olivier was talking about, was central government programs that the Trudeau government could credit claim for. And so my question to you based on that was, what are the specific institutional factors in Canada that allow the central government or the Prime Minister to design the kind of programs that you have shown in your empirical graphs led to an expansion of social welfare spending, or what you called the fading of redistribution? So that was my specific question. And then just a quick comment to Andre to bring in actually Kinga's work, which I think was really cool. Your ideal model that you explain in Australia doesn't exist anymore, because in 2018, exactly like Kinga said, we had a strong state, Western Australia, your Alberta, who said that because of the technical formula, they'd lost revenues, so they demanded a political buyout. And then all the fiscally weak states banded together and said that it was un-Australian that the wealthiest state got a buyout and they didn't. So we've politicized ours, but exactly for the reverse of what you described, because we have a vertical fiscal imbalance. Now we're in a situation where the states are using equalization as leverage against the Commonwealth, where you've totally described the opposite. So I just think there's an interesting dynamic there, and it totally fits Kinga's theoretical framework, which I thought was just really nice of your framework. It's very useful. Thank you.
Please turn the microphone, because otherwise at home they won't listen to you.
I mean, I completely agree with you. To me, I never speak about equalization as kind of reducing inequality, right? I mean, it mitigates the consequences of inequality, right? In Canada, I mean, discrepancies to me are a result of two things, essentially different developmental patterns, you know, we're linked to natural resources a lot, of course, in Atlantic provinces, you know, fisheries, and so on and so forth. And two, of course, is the price of oil, right? But what equalization does year after year is mitigate the consequences of those things. And as you said, I think dealing with those things, it involves industrial policy, regional development policy, and different things. So I think I agree with you entirely. Are natural resources revenues shared in Canada with the federal government? No. Or with the other provinces? No, is the short answer. Francisco, I think, you know, equalization, it's a program, it does all of these things, but it's also a symbol, right? And that's, I think, that your work, right, it's the product of framing, I guess, you know, like in a sense, in Canadian history, it's fairly new, right? I mean, before the 2000s, you don't really, you know, you have Western alienation and you have Albertan discontent towards the federal government, but it doesn't go through equalization. It's not spoken in relation to equalization, right? Which brings us to the referendum. Of course, yes, it was held by a premier in Alberta who said, I'm asking the question to you, do you want equalization to be, the principle of making equalization payments to be removed from the Canadian Constitution, but that's not what I'm going to do. So I'm asking you this question, but if you answer yes, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to press for that. I'm going to go see the Prime Minister and say, what can you do for me? The people are unhappy. And the Albertans actually voted, I think it was 63% to support the Premier, who later resigned over COVID handling and all this. So this issue is dead, essentially, you know. And just lastly, I mean, I'm well aware of kind of the WA situation and equalization, but I'm still partial. I'm still partial to a less political governing on equalization, right? So maybe I shouldn't call it the Australian model anyway, at this point. I should just call it the arm's length agency model. And, you know, again, I think that I recognize there's lots of problems with that. You know, somebody like Anwar Shah, for example, who's Canadian, would say, Canada's way of doing it is more democratic because it's actually elected people who decide on this. Maybe I've just been traumatized by kind of the early 2000 dispute on equalization that I always seem to be looking for an alternative in governing it. Yeah. That's it.
On the question, I think it's a good question, can we have too much equalization? Okay, can we have too much equalization? Some country, the US, has no equalization. And the substitute to equalization is geographic mobility. If you're too poor where you live, go live where wealth is. And there are good arguments to make in defense of this position. But I think for a federation to work, you need equalization. And I think you can have too little equalization. That's the case when because there are consequences. Putting together unequal territories has consequences. And in Canada, for instance, André referred to the price of oil. There is probably, or there was when oil was very expensive, a Dutch effect. That is, the money, the value of the Canadian dollar increases, and it hurts manufacturing industries in non-oil producing provinces. And therefore, there's a good case that can be made in such circumstances for equalization. The crisis of the euro in the sovereign crisis in Europe also suggested that it would be good to have, if you share money, currency, you should also share some income. So I think it doesn't mean, as André said, it doesn't mean that you equalize everything, but you should equalize. And Trevor Toombe, who has worked with André on equalization, has introduced the notion of implicit equalization, which is the idea that even without an equalization program, there is equalization in a federation because rich regions pay more taxes and consume less services than poorer or older populations, and so money goes around. Regarding Tracy's question on credit claiming, or I think it's critical that the federal government wants to be able to be recognized for what it does. And in fact, in Canada, we have in almost every, not almost, in every electoral campaigns at the federal level, the parties battle over issues of provincial jurisdiction. They say, we will do this, we will do that, and it's all provincial jurisdiction issues, because a lot of what people care about is services of proximity, healthcare and social services and so on. The federal parties are tempted to say, we'll do something about this, but making a transfer doesn't allow you to claim a credit very well. And even we saw, we no longer have shared cost programs in Canada, because shared cost programs depended on the collaboration of provinces with the federal government to implement under certain conditions, and it didn't work. So what we see in recent years is, and we've seen that before, is the federal government more keen on introducing cash benefits to households rather than transfer. That was the message also of Olivier yesterday.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the questions. As to the first point on looking at the gas price cap as successful lobbying, that's a very, very good suggestion. Thank you. And to answer Milan's question, I think the question pertains to, did party politics influence the outcome? And so the federal government was liberal, and the most vocal provinces that I'm looking at were conservative. Now, the reason why I've kind of ruled out, well, it does factor in a little bit, of course. I mean, perhaps there were more optimistic agreements made to the Atlantic provinces, to the very vocal conservative Premier, Danny Williams, because, well, to buy votes. But the reason why this doesn't really apply, because when you trace back the months of this negotiation, actually there were promises made by the federal government to the Atlantic provinces, which then were not upheld. So in the end, they had to start from scratch anyway after the federal elections, because there were federal elections in the midst of these negotiations, and they all had to start from scratch. So I've ruled that out as a very powerful variable. Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, we are going to wrap up with a final speak by Mikel Erkoreka. He will be giving the closing speech. Mikel.
Hau itxi behar zaie? Webex bai, baina horrein jarraitu behar dugu online, sartuko da hau, palermo, Bada espadas. Jon. Francesco has to speak after me. Yes, but just for taking into account what...
Pero acá no tiene link de esto, se lo vamos a pasar.
¿Cuál?
No tiene link de esto.
Vale.
Porque no sabemos que hablamos. Entonces le vamos a pasar el link.
Ok. Avísale a Petra que le avise. ¿Cuál es el de esta sesión? Istendo, minimizados. Vale. Ederto. A ver. Sorry, it's just for some logistic points for you. Okay, after this last session, and we finish with all the conceptual part of the conference, just for starting and before closing the conference, some brief tips for tonight and for tomorrow. First of all, today we will have the dinner here in the Café Iruña. In case that you are not going to go from the hotel that most of us are host, just take the reference. We have the dinner tonight at 9 here in the Café Iruña. Gisela and someone, if you are not going to come to the hotel, just take it into account. Anyway, after finishing now the conference, we will help the people that want to go to the hotel, and we will go with you there. You have 1 hour and a half for resting or having a shower or what you want, and we will wait you, John, me, and I think that Andoni, in the entrance of the hotel at 8:45. Okay, 8:45 in the entrance of both entrances of the hotel, and go at 9 to have dinner here. All is clear for tonight? Vale. For tomorrow, I know that some of you are not going to come to Guernica, but just for explaining you, if someone that still hasn't paid, but wants to come tomorrow, please just let us know for avoiding some trouble tomorrow that someone doesn't appear or something like that. I think that all of you have said if you are not going to, or not going to come, but if someone hasn't paid and wants to come tomorrow, please let us know. No, okay. Okay, for tomorrow, just also the logistic part of the plan of tomorrow. Tomorrow, we will pick you in the hotel at 8:45, 8:45 in the morning. If someone is not going to come from the general hotel, please, you have to be at 9 o'clock in the morning in front of the Iglesia de San Nicolás. Take a photo or do what you want, but please take the reference, Iglesia de San Nicolás. You have here the direction, and it's very, very near the hotel. Yes, yeah. The place you are sleeping, okay. No, but I'm going to say, you are just 1 minute, just be in the street of both entrances. So it's my hotel. Right. Yes. Most of you are in the same hotel with some exceptions, but for these exceptions, just to take into account where they have to be at 9 o'clock. The rest, you have to be at 8:45 in the entrance of both hotel entrance. Both hotels. Yes.
Miguel, please, regarding this city, where is that restaurant? Is it closer to this place or to our hotel?
No, we are from the hotel. We pick you at 8:45, and in 10 minutes we are in the restaurant, walking.
Is it closer to this place or?
No, the hotel. It's quite. It's very near. It's just in the other side of the bridge, but near the hotel. For tonight, it's very near the hotel. We are 10 minutes from the hotel walking. Okay, for tomorrow, please, all of you have cleared 8:45 in the entrance of the hotel. 9, if you don't come from the general hotel, you have to be here, Iglesia San Nicolás, that it's just near the hotel. It's more or less here. And we are going to go there for going to Guernica. And then just also to know how it's going to be the return, we will arrive at 4:30 to the airport. If some of you want to go directly from the excursion to the airport, just take your luggage, and the rest of you, we will arrive around 5 to Bilbao again. Okay? It's all clear for tomorrow? Okay. A ver, bueno, in addition to these logistic issues, yes, Xavi? Okay. Well, in addition to the logistic issues, I would like also to end with a more solemn speech, very brief, don't be afraid. First of all, I would like to especially thank John Garro and Xavier Murua for your great work in organizing the conference. Secondly, and of course also I would like to thank sincerely for all of you on behalf of Joseba Aguirre-Ezcuénaga, the director of the Ituna Center, and all the whole Ituna Center team for coming here and to Bilbao, and for your participation both in person and online. I really thank you for you. Without any doubt, it has been a great success for our center to be part or to join the IACFS federal family 5 years ago. You wouldn't regret it, I can assure you. And it has been a great, great pleasure to host this great conference, internationally renowned conference, and we hope you enjoyed it at least as much as we have did. We have discussed highly hot topics on the present and future of federalism all around the world. As you know, and it's nothing new, but the economy and finances are fundamental pillars for the proper, efficient, but also fair functioning of the federal systems. And I believe that in this conference we have studied and internationally contrasted really relevant aspects in this sense. In the coming weeks, we will assess, together with the, I don't know if the old or the new executive committee, the possibility and option to publish the proceedings, and we keep you informed in this sense about if there is any new. And I don't have nothing more to say. I would like to thank you again for your participation, and I hope you enjoy the last days or the time you stay here in Bilbao. And I give now the floor to Francesco Palermo in order to, I changed. There is a last minute change in the planning. I'm not sure if he's going to enter. Okay, in that case, I give the floor to the new director of the IACFS, Maria.
So apparently we have lost Francesco somewhere in the web. So I speak in the name of Francesco Palermo, and I would like to thank all of you, but most of all the Ituna Center for hosting us, for being a terrific organizer. So my thanks go to Joseba, Mikel, Andoni, Jan, Javier. I think I have mentioned all the names. I would also like to thank the Basque government for participating and contributing to this conference. In my own name, I would like to say that I very much look forward to the excursion, to the publication, and to meet you all in Philadelphia. Also in my own name, I'd like to warmly thank Francesco Palermo for being a terrific president for the last 6 years. I'm quite intimidated to take over that job, but I also very much look forward to it. So see you all tonight, see you all tomorrow, see you all next year in Philadelphia. Bye.